Good afternoon, everyone. You won't believe how long it took to find out what font they use on Sex in the City. But, a word of advice, don't ever Google that phrase in an open plan office or on a corporate system. Okay, I'm going to introduce the Counters Creek SuDS retrofit pilot trials and then hand over to Tabatha to talk more about the delivery. What is Counters Creek? Well, Counters Creek is one of London's lost rivers, one of the tributaries of the Thames, which by the late 19th century was so polluted and encroached upon that they piped it up, and it is now a combined sewer. The catchment area covers boroughs such as Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington and Chelsea, parts of Camden, heavily urbanised, and has become far more urbanised due to urban creep in the last sort of 30 to 40 years, to the extent that we calculate it's lost a fifth of its green space or permeable area between 1970 and 2007, with the combined sewer being the only drainage channel for the area, as it were. Then obviously that has a big impact on the storm response of the sewer. The area is also quite vulnerable to sewer flooding because a lot of the residents live below ground in inhabited basements. We calculate around 37,000 of them in the catchment area, of which we know that 2,000 approximately are at risk of flooding. So, as part of a much larger strategic flood alleviation scheme, the largest that we've ever embarked upon, we asked the question, what component could SuDS retrofit be in that solution in reducing that storm response in the sewerage system? And you can see the before and after curves there. It's very important for us, if we're going to commit to a widespread program of this, that we have confidence in the effectiveness of it. So the concept of the SuDS pilot trials was to be able to quantify the reduction in things like impermeable area, the reduction in both peak flow and volume flow to the sewers. In other words, on the lower graph, how reliably could we manage that gap there? The concept of the trials was to take three areas, three streets that we would retrofit, monitor the before and after performance, but each street has a parallel or an adjacent control street which would also be monitored but won't be modified to sense check the results of the retrofit. What are the questions within that question? How effectively will SuDS work? What are the questions we have to answer? Will communities allow us to adapt their properties and the street outside? You know, it's very much, it is a NIMBY question. It's not so much in their backyard, but it's with their backyard. So we do need the consent of owner-occupiers and residents. Would highway authorities allow us to modify the streets, with those being one of the largest components of the impermeable area? Would it be cost beneficial? Would it work at a price that we could afford to pay? Can we do it on sufficient scale? You know, we've seen lots of demonstrations of what can be done, but can we do it on a catchment-wide scale sufficiently to impact on the flood risk? Who will maintain them? And can that effectiveness be maintained over their lifetime? So, obviously, the key part of the trial is to quantify the benefits, and obviously that's going to be measured in terms of flow, impacts on flow. So, we put flow, depth, velocity sensors, rain gauges in the ground in May 2012, and they've been gathering data of the before ever since. Now, it's quite challenging to monitor some of these flows because we had to make the target areas hydraulically discrete from the rest of the network, otherwise, because we're talking very large trunk sewers, the impact of the retrofit could easily be lost in the noise of the wider network. So consequently, we are measuring quite low and quite intermittent flows often. So we're regularly revisiting the flow monitoring, doing calibration checks on them, and results are fed back to an independent advisory group of expert academics and engineers who then give feedback on how to improve accuracy. The aim is to build a verified and audited hydraulic model to quantify the before and after. When the SuDS measures go in, they will be monitored individually as well as en masse, so that we can look at look at the performance of individual measures and as a whole. The 3 streets in question, the first one, Arundel Gardens, they're very much sort of typical central London, heavily urbanised, quite a challenging environment to try and retrofit SuDS in. I think if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere. Initially, in addition to whatever on-property measures could be retrofitted, we were looking at tree pits and rain gardens around tree pits. Now, we were advised by the council to stay very well clear of the footpath because beneath the footpath, basements extend under there in the form of coal bunkers, many of which have now been incorporated into the inhabited space. Whenever the council does work on the footpath, they're barraged with complaints and claims that there's now water ingress to the properties where there wasn't before. So they said, don't go near the footpath. But what they then said was, why don't you retrofit permeable paving to the road? Which, before they changed their mind, we agreed to, because we thought that a permeable road surface in a busily trafficked central London street, we thought would be quite a useful trial. So we conceded that one. We remain committed to the concept of tree pits as part of a wider urban retrofit, so much so that we've contributed both technically and financially to a design guide produced by the Trees and Design Action Group, which is now out in draft for consultation, because as was mentioned in an earlier presentation, we think that tree pits will be a valuable tool in our SuDS armoury. Mendora Road, a very typical type of street you'd find up and down the land in any major town. Probably get it slightly cheaper in other parts of the country, but totally typical. Here, in addition again to property level measures, we're looking at permeable surfaces, not in the main wheel track, but in the parking spaces on either side of the road. That, from an aesthetics point of view, that does have the advantage of delineating the parking spaces from the rest of the carriageway. It also enables us to be able to trial 2 different forms of subsurface storage on the same street, a very sort of engineered permavoid type of solution on one side of the street and a simple aggregate one on the other. It also means that the below ground storage is very much where all the buried services and utilities are, so it's going to be a very good demonstration of the appetite for utility companies to feed their services through these quite new types of construction for them. And lastly, Molina Road, which is a little bit more suburban in feel, in that it's got a park, it's got a pedestrianised area and a school. Again, though very, very typical housing stock. And the solution we're looking at is very much by getting the water into that pedestrianised area, into rills, and then into rain gardens. We're not currently looking at utilising the park. Maybe Tabatha might have something to say about that in a moment. But that's an artist impression of the Molinas Road, including some rather truncated children who appear to be buried up to the waist, but perhaps that's some form of behavioural control, I'm not sure. Previous speakers have mentioned stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement has been very key to this. Obviously, the wider flood alleviation scheme has been holding lots of public meetings since the last major event. We have been having written communications with the residents, drop-in sessions, again, mailing them outline designs to get feedback. We also have a flood bus which has visited the streets and carried out on-street consultations, and some members of the audience were helped in supporting that. What has that achieved? Well, if you look at the before and after, I think that the relationship with both lead local flood authorities has been very positive and supportive from the outset, both to the wider scheme and to SuDS. And it's developed really. We're working very closely with Hammersmith and Fulham. They're doing their own SuDS pilot trials, which was mentioned earlier, and we've both agreed that we're going to share data and share resources, which Tabatha will touch on more. We've worked with Kensington and Chelsea on developing some SuDS design toolkits for planners. So on the whole, you know, we're working closely together there. The residents, I think in the immediate aftermath of a major flooding event, I think the best kind of relationship you can hope for is a non-violent one. Obviously, some very large, very animated public meetings, which is perfectly understandable, but as we've explained to the residents, you know, our plans, our wider programme, the SuDS pilots, it has improved. Attendance at meetings has dropped off as people sort of need to get on with their lives, but those residents who remain engaged are generally very supportive of the SuDS pilots. I mentioned very briefly the conservation societies and other local neighbourhood groups who are very active, very effective and very vocal in the area. They again are supportive of the scheme, to the point where they have approached us because they're very instrumental in the planning process, so they know what development is coming, and they approached us to offer their help in opposing development which might increase flood risk, and we have had a dialogue with them on that. So it's been a journey. We're still on the journey. We haven't got to implementation yet, but on the whole, I think we've taken the majority of stakeholders with us. And really that concludes what I had to say about what Tabatha refers to as the fluffy part of the presentation. I will now hand over to her to do the hard-nosed engineering. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So yes, I'm Tabatha Bailey, Head of Programme Delivery for Counters Creek, and as David was saying, I've taken the programme on with a budget to deliver it. Before it was a feasibility study, now we're into delivery. So the first thing I wanted to do is review the scope and ensure that what we're delivering is deliverable. And so that means working out what the drivers are, validating any changes we make, and reviewing the results that we do. So where sustainability is concerned, my view is sustainability is like a three-legged stool. If you don't have environmental sustainability, you'll fall over. If you don't have economic sustainability, you'll fall over. And if you don't have social sustainability, you'll fall over. So if you look at sustainability from an engineering perspective, you will miss two very important aspects. And social sustainability is ensuring you've got that engagement from your local communities and that you've got a maintenance agreement that they will buy into and they will be part of delivering the solution. And where economic sustainability is concerned, can you afford to do it? Can you afford to do it now, and can you afford to repeat it in the future? So one of the first things I looked at was, how much money have I got? What are the quotes that came in? And the quotes that came in were massively higher than the money I had. So what do? Well, one of the first things I did was to deduplicate any of the aspects in the pilot that we were putting forward. At one point, we had 2 rainwater harvesting elements to the pilot, which weren't actually adding any more than doubling the cost of the rainwater harvesting. We had some green roofs in there, and we've learnt quite quickly, before we even needed to construct them, private green roofs are a very, very expensive thing to do. They're often on someone's flat roof that would then need to be strengthened, that would then need to have hand railing around it, that would then need to have access around it, and the small amount of roof space that you would then be greening is not cost effective unless you're doing it on a large school, unless you're doing it on a public building. But in someone's back garden, rolling out green roofs individually was not cost effective. So we took out the green roofs, we deduplicated it, and as David said, working closely with the council, we have removed the tree pits from Arundel Gardens and come up with a permeable road space. Another area of Thames water, we had a programme called Opportunistic SuDS, which is not strictly part of the pilot that we're doing now, but previous engagement with some residents in the boroughs had meant we had some people that were interested in doing permeable driveways, and that's something that I believe needs to be looked at and is a repeatable thing that we could do across London if we could encourage people to depave their front gardens, put in a SuDS measure into their front gardens or their driveways. That's something I'm exploring. So some of the areas I took off because they were too expensive, but permeable driveways I think is something worth pursuing. So we looked at it, we had a long day workshop, and then we got our 3 wise professors from the IAG, the Independent Advisory Group, to ensure that our pilot remains robust. And that's a really critical element, that we've got a robust pilot that measures it beforehand, predicts what we want to see, and then validates that what we predicted has actually been delivered. So what I didn't want was a lot of information to be gathered and then someone at the very end to make some calculations and decide what the result was. I want midway through an audit of the hydraulic model and predictions on what we're going to get from these measures. So at the end, we've got a robust toolkit of where we would go forward. So that's very much buying into the SuDS, not DUDS. This is not lip service. This is trying to come up with a toolkit of what will work in the future. So, all-day workshop, kindly organised by George Warren. And in fact, without George's input, George Warren, the flood manager for Hammersmith and Fulham, without his input and his enthusiasm, I think you'd only worked for a couple of weeks when we first met. Nothing quite like the eager new person on the block. And he organised highways, parks, himself being flooding, the arboriculturalists, the procurement department, the environmental projects and policy, biodiversity and horticulture, and forward planning. And a number of those are actually by borough. But as I believe Jeremy was saying, if you don't get everybody in the room that matters, and I think you had this Llanelli facilitation group, you're onto a hiding to nothing. You'll have a single view of something, and often there are, within boroughs, some departments don't always get on with other departments. As we know, you may have a highways department that has one agenda, but a planning department that has another agenda. And so what was critical to us was get everybody in a room, and actually that's how we worked through every single design, and that's where we came up with the permeable road space. It wasn't until we understood the constraints and the very shallow nature of the footpath above those basements that we realised moving those magnolia trees was going to cause us a problem. And actually, because of the works they've had in that street, they know that those local vocal residents would cause a problem in the future. So both boroughs expressed a desire to be both innovative and ambitious. So good, I've put it in twice. So, permeable road space. But one of the big innovations that we're exploring, it all depends on the prices we get in, but I've worked in transportation before, and handing over assets from one entity to another entity is always a nightmare. Handover issues are, there's rats up the ducts, there's this, it's not quite what we expected. If we could get away from that altogether, we would be getting rid of a risk in the future of this being a continuous and maintained asset. So before I even mentioned it, fortunately the Highways Department said, how about we put in these SuDS measures? How about we get our term maintenance contractors, who are ultimately going to be responsible for maintaining these, to actually construct them? It was something I was going to ask them, but it's always good for them to tell me. So yes, we've said that would be fine. Depending on the price, I'm certainly not going to do something that's more costly, but if that cost comes in lower than our term maintenance contractors, it's something that we will most definitely be pursuing. So focusing on the maintenance element of it is really critical for accepting this asset into the future. If we can minimise maintenance as far as possible, all well and good. If we can maximise community involvement in that maintenance, all well and good. So those are the things that we know that are going to make a difference when it goes to committee, because the local authorities are not going to want to take on an asset that has a high overhead to maintain. So designing minimal maintenance, ensuring those rain gardens have the input from the arboriculturalists and the horticulture departments. Are we picking the right plants for the right particular space that we're dealing with? Have we looked at the shade that we're going to be dealing with? Have we understood what the constraints of the soil are? Are we picking the right plants that can almost self-maintain them? And things like that are very, very minor, but critical for the sustainability of the scheme. So, as I say, if we can use the term maintenance contractors of the council, we will reduce handover issues, we'll increase the confidence that they will be able to maintain them, and we give the term contractors who are going to have to maintain them and hopefully be somebody that will roll this out more in the future, the experience they need right from the outset on delivering SuDS. So that leads into an event for utility companies and highways authorities. Irrespective of who delivers these, once we have put these measures in the streets, we plan to hold a seminar, summit, forum, where we invite the utility companies, the highways engineers, TfL streets teams, highways contractors, to actually physically see them. And when I'm talking about highways contractors, I'm not talking about CEOs. I'm not interested at this point in meeting CEOs. I'm interested in meeting people that are actually going to be looking at it. So who are the streetworks, the site engineers who need to ensure this work is carried out correctly? They're the ones that I want to show the permavoid crates to, not a CEO of a company. And that level of contact with the people that are going to be on the street, I believe, is going to be really critical for them to understand it, because the last thing we want is they come and maintain it and they fill it up with concrete, because they didn't know it, they didn't recognise it, they didn't care about it, but so we need them to care from the outset. And taking on what Jeremy said and several other people have said, we already have in our budget an amount of money for AECOM, who have designed these schemes, to be the site assurance engineers. And we will ensure that those levels and those contours are followed exactly to the letter, so we ensure that these work. And I'm glad you said it, because I can feed that back as a very strong justification as to why we need that very strong hook back to AECOM that we deliver what we designed. So where we are in the milestones and the delivery of this, we have been, as David said, having a very strong baseline, monitoring baseline, so the before and after. The initial stakeholder engagement period is continuing, and our design reviews and approvals are continuing closely with the council. We're now defining the procurement stage and writing the heads of terms for delivering this with the council. And we hope to install in the last 2 quarters of this year. We will then continue to monitor the SuDS, and then by about the early 2016, we will have the final report. And that final report, not only is it going to cover the 3 streets that we're dealing with, but SuDS is happening, as you've seen from many examples. Thames Water do lots of small elements of SuDS across the Peast, and Hammersmith and Fulham have done their own schemes across the Peast. Hopefully Australia Road will be constructed within this period as well, and Goldhawk Road similarly. We will be pulling that and pooling that information for this final report. It may not have the same rigour of the before and after that the 3 streets have, but you can model the benefits, you can assess the benefits, and you certainly know the costs of them. So we will try and ensure that we get a toolkit that informs Thames Water's future investment opportunities and sharing with the local authority to help enhance their SuDS measures across the Peast. Thank you very much.